He fired her on a Thursday. By Friday, he was standing outside her door. Nobody who worked for Voss did anything without a reason. That was the first thing every new hire learned. The man didn't breathe without calculating the return, so when he personally drove 40 minutes across the city to a building that didn't have a working elevator in the rain, without telling anyone where he was going, there had to be a reason. The problem was, he didn't have one. Not one he could write down, anyway. Mara had worked for Dominic Voss for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew this not because she'd been counting, but because she kept a running log of her hours in a small leather notebook she bought from a discount bin at a drugstore on 5th. Every hour, every task, every discrepancy in the payroll, she quietly fixed before anyone noticed. She'd grown up in a house where money disappeared without explanation, and she'd learned early that the only way to survive that kind of uncertainty was to document everything. Voss's organization wasn't so different from that house, really. Money moved in strange directions. Numbers were adjusted. Certain figures simply ceased to exist on paper. Mara didn't ask questions. She just kept her own records, separate from the official ones, tucked into that notebook and into a password-protected folder on a USB drive she wore on a chain around her neck, like other women wore crosses. She wasn't saving herself. She was just being careful. Voss had hired her through a third party. She'd never applied. Someone had passed her name along. She never found out who, and one morning a man in a grey suit showed up at the diner where she was waitressing and slid a card across the counter with a number on it. Just a number. No name, no title. She called it because her landlord had just raised the rent and her second job had cut her hours, and she was 3 weeks from having to move back to a city she'd spent 6 years escaping. The interview was 20 minutes. Voss had asked her 4 questions, looked at the spreadsheet she'd brought to demonstrate her work, and then told her she started Monday. That was it. She'd spent 2 years wondering if she'd made the right call. Most days, she decided she had. The money was real. The work made sense to her, and Voss, for all his coldness, was at least consistent. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He didn't smile at you and then gut you later. When he wanted something, he said so. When he was displeased, you knew. There was a brutal kind of honesty in that, and Mara, who'd been lied to by people who smiled constantly, found it easier to work with than most people would have expected. She just never expected him to be honest about letting her go. He called her into the office on a Thursday at 4 in the afternoon. She thought it was about the Renner account. She'd flagged an irregularity 2 days before and hadn't heard back. She brought the file. She sat down across from him and put the file on the desk and waited. He looked at the file, then at her. "Your position is being eliminated," he said. She'd heard the phrase before. It had always been a lie, a way of making it sound structural when it was actually personal. She looked at him and waited for the rest. The apology, maybe. The reassurance, the offer to write her a reference. None of it came. "Effective today," he said. "Hendricks will walk you out." She picked up the file. She stood up. She said, okay, because there wasn't anything else to say, and because she'd promised herself years ago she would never beg. Hendricks walked her to her desk, watched her pack the few things she kept there, a phone charger, a cardigan she'd left over the back of her chair, a small succulent that had somehow survived 2 years in a windowless office. She didn't take the notebook. That went home with her every night. She'd never left it at the office. Hendricks walked her to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She got in. She didn't look back. She made it to her apartment before she stopped moving. That was the thing about surviving. You kept going until you didn't have to anymore, and then your body just stopped. She dropped her bag inside the door, sat down on the floor with her back against the couch, and stayed there for a while, not crying. She was past the crying phase of things. She'd cried so much in her early 20s that she seemed to have used it up. Now when things fell apart, she just went very still and very quiet, and waited for her mind to catch up with what had happened. Her mind was slow about it this time. She'd lost jobs before. She'd been fired once, laid off twice, had a contract simply not renewed without explanation once, which was somehow the worst. She knew how to handle it. You filed for unemployment. You updated your resume. You sent out applications. You didn't let yourself think too much about the gap in time between now and the next thing, because that gap had a way of swallowing you if you looked at it directly. She knew all of that. What she didn't know was what to do with the fact that she was scared. Not of being unemployed. She had been unemployed before. She was scared because of the notebook, because of what was in it, because she'd spent 2 years documenting things that people in Voss's position didn't like documented, and she'd always assumed that as long as she was useful to him, the notebook wasn't a threat to anyone. She wasn't planning to use it. She'd never planned to use it. It was just insurance, the kind you hoped you'd never need. Now she didn't work for him anymore. And she didn't know what that meant. She got off the floor eventually, changed her clothes, made tea she didn't drink, sat at the small table by the window of her apartment and looked out at the alley below, where the same orange cat that had been living behind the dumpster for 8 months was making its slow, deliberate way across the wet asphalt. She thought, I need a plan. She opened her laptop and stared at a blank document for 45 minutes. She closed the laptop. She went to bed at 8:30 because she didn't know what else to do with a Thursday night that was supposed to be different. She woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. Her apartment building was old. It made sounds. Pipes, neighbors, the particular moan of the structure settling into the cold. She'd learned its vocabulary over 3 years of living there, and she knew which sounds meant nothing and which sounds meant she should pay attention. This sound meant she should pay attention. She was off the bed before she was fully awake, reaching for the small canister of pepper spray she kept on the nightstand. She stood in the dark and listened. The sound came again, a soft knock, almost reluctant, like someone who'd changed their mind halfway through the motion. It was coming from her front door. She put on the light in the hallway, looked through the peephole. Dominic Voss was standing in the hallway of her building. She stared at him for a moment. He was in a dark coat, soaked through at the shoulders from rain she hadn't known was falling. He was looking at the door with an expression she'd never seen on him before, which was to say, no expression at all. Not the controlled blankness he wore in meetings, something more like exhaustion. Something more like a man who'd driven 40 minutes in the rain and wasn't entirely sure why. She stepped back from the door. She didn't open it. She stood in the hallway of her own apartment and thought about the notebook on the bedside table and the USB drive on its chain around her neck and the fact that Dominic Voss did not do anything without a reason. He knocked again, not louder, just again. Mara. His voice through the door was quieter than she expected. I'm not here to. He stopped, started over. I'm not here about the records. She almost laughed. Of course he knew. He always knew. That was the thing about working for someone like Voss. He was never as uninformed as you hoped. She opened the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which was very unlike both of them. You have about 30 seconds to tell me why you're here, she said, before I close this door. He looked past her into the apartment. Not scanning, exactly. More like he was taking inventory of something. She watched him take in the bare walls, the stacked boxes she'd never fully unpacked after 3 years, the kitchen table covered in papers she was always going to file and never did. Why do you still have boxes? He said. 20 seconds. He looked back at her. Something moved in his face. Reinhardt is coming for me, he said. He has been for 6 months. I've been trying to. He stopped again. She'd never seen him stop that many times in a single conversation. The elimination of your position. It wasn't structural. I know it wasn't structural. It was supposed to protect you. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The orange cat from the alley had somehow gotten into the stairwell again and was making its opinions known from somewhere below. Mara looked at the man in her hallway, soaked through and tired in a way she'd never seen on him, and felt something shift very slightly in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something adjacent to understanding. She stepped back from the door. You have 5 minutes, she said, and you're dripping on my floor. He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of her small living room. and told her about Reinhardt, about the 6 months, about the thing that had happened in October that had made everything accelerate. He told her without looking at her directly, which she'd noticed before. Voss delivered bad news to the middle distance, as if the words were less dangerous if they didn't travel directly from one person to another. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She was good at listening. It was one of the things that had made her valuable, the ability to let a person arrive at the actual point. The actual point, when it came, was this: someone inside his organization had been feeding information to Reinhardt for months. Not financial records, operational information, schedules, routes, personnel. The kind of information that got people hurt. 3 people had already been hurt, and whoever was doing it had access to the same accounts Mara had managed. She sat down on the arm of the couch. "You thought it was me," she said. "For about 48 hours, he said. Then I looked at the actual records." Something in his voice shifted. "You kept better records than anyone I've ever employed. It's not a compliment if you fired me first." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. He looked at the wall. The rain had started again outside. She could hear it on the single window in the living room, the one that faced the alley. "So why are you here?" she said. "If I'm cleared." He was quiet for a moment. "Reinhardt knows who you are," he said. "He saw you leave with a box today." She hadn't thought of that. She turned it over in her mind, found the edges of it, understood the shape of it. "He thinks I took something when I left," she said. "He thinks you have leverage," Voss said. "And he wants it." "Do I have leverage?" The question landed in the room between them and sat there. She hadn't meant to ask it like that, like an offer, or maybe like a test. But it came out that way, and she didn't take it back. Voss looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. "That depends," he said, "on what you kept." She thought about the notebook, about the chain around her neck, about 2 years of careful documentation done not for power but for survival, and the strange way those 2 things had a tendency to become the same thing without you noticing. "I kept everything," she said. He didn't leave. That was the part she hadn't planned for. She'd assumed he would say what he came to say and go, because that was what Voss did. He accomplished the objective and exited. He didn't stay. He didn't linger. She had never once seen him in a room longer than he needed to be. But it was 2:30 in the morning, and the rain was heavier now, and when she went to put the kettle on, mostly to give her hands something to do, he followed her into the kitchen and stood there in his wet coat and didn't leave. She made 2 cups of tea. She put one on the counter near him. He looked at it like he'd never seen tea before. "You're going to want to get out of that coat," she said. "You're dripping again." He took off the coat. She hung it over the back of a chair. He was wearing a dark shirt underneath. She could see the edge of a scar along his left forearm, old and pale, the kind that had been serious once and was just a fact now. She didn't ask about it. He didn't volunteer. They stood in her kitchen at 2:30 in the morning and drank tea, which was possibly the strangest thing that had happened to her in a year full of strange things. "The Renner account," she said eventually. "What about it? I flagged an irregularity 2 days ago. You never responded." He picked up the tea. "Set it down again." "I know," he said. "Was it Renner?" "Renner was a conduit. Someone used his account to move information. The discrepancy I found was the trail," he said. "Yes." She absorbed this. Thought about 2 days ago, sitting at her desk, looking at a number that was 3 points off in a way that shouldn't have been possible, writing it up in a memo that went to Voss's office and apparently changed everything. "So I found it," she said. "Yes, and then you fired me. I needed you out of the building before whoever was responsible realized what you'd found." She looked at him. He looked at the counter. "You could have told me," she said. "You could have just told me. You would have stayed," he said. "You would have kept working, kept digging, and whoever it is would have noticed." She wanted to argue with that. She turned it over, found the places where he was wrong, and then found the place where he wasn't. She would have stayed. She would have kept digging. She wouldn't have been able to stop herself. "You know me pretty well," she said, "for someone who never looked at me directly in 2 years." Something happened in his expression, Not quite a smile, not anything she had a name for. "I look," he said. "I'm just careful about it." The rain outside was very loud now. The orange cat had apparently made it into the building's first-floor hallway and was making its opinions known from directly below her apartment. She could feel the cold coming off his coat from where it hung on the chair. "You said Reinhardt thinks I have leverage," she said. "He does. And you came here at 2 in the morning in the rain." She paused. "Not to get the records. No. Then what?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer, long enough that she started to reach for her mug again, just to have something to do with her hands. "I came to make sure you were all right," he said. She stopped reaching. The kitchen was very quiet. The kettle ticked as it cooled. Outside, the rain shifted and she heard it coming at the window from a different angle. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. "I can see that." He was looking at her again. Directly. This time the way he hadn't in the living room, the way she couldn't remember him ever doing in 2 years of working in the same building. She had a face that people looked at and immediately categorized and marved past. She knew that, had always known it, had learned to use it. Voss had always seemed to do the same. A glance, a calibration, move on. He wasn't moving on. "Your boxes," he said. "You haven't unpacked in 3 years. I work a lot. That's not why." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not." He left at 4 in the morning, not because the conversation had run out of things to say, but because she asked him to. She had to think. She needed the apartment to herself, and the rain outside, and the quiet that came after a storm started to soften, and she needed to sit with the particular quality of the last 2 hours and understand what had happened in them. He left without arguing. He picked up his coat from the chair where it had mostly dried. He paused at the door with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. "Reinhardt will move quickly," he said. "Once he knows you don't have what he's looking for." "I do have what he's looking for," she said. "I have better than what he's looking for." He looked at her. "I kept records of the irregularities," she said. "Not just the Renner account. All of them. 2 years of them." She touched the chain at her neck without meaning to. "Whoever has been feeding Reinhardt, their fingerprints are all over those records. You just have to know what you're looking at." He was very still. "Do you trust me?" she said. "Or don't you?" A long pause, rain on glass, the cat below. The 2 of them in the doorway of her apartment at 4 in the morning. "Yes," he said, simply the way he said everything, like the word had been decided long before she asked for it. "Then let me come back in," she said, "officially or not. I don't care, but let me finish what I found." He studied her for a moment, not the calibrating glance she was used to, something longer, something that acknowledged her in a way she wasn't sure what to do with. "Monday," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. Another pause. Something that was very nearly a smile. "Tomorrow," he said. He called at 7 in the morning. She was already awake, already at the table, the notebook open in front of her, pencil in hand. She'd been up since 5. She'd made real coffee, not tea, and she'd pulled every notation she'd made about the Renner account and the 3 accounts adjacent to it, and she'd started to see something that she needed another hour to confirm. She answered on the 2nd ring. "You're already working," he said. "Not a question." "How did you know?" "Because you would be." She looked at the notebook, at 2 years of careful, small handwriting that she'd made in cheap pens on the train home and at the kitchen table, and sometimes in the parking garage waiting for the late bus, all the small observations she'd recorded because she couldn't not, because the part of her brain that caught wrongness in a column of numbers never fully switched off. "There are 4 of them," she said. "Not 1. 4 people with access and motive, and they've been rotating the activity so no single account shows a pattern. But when you look at all of them together, Mara." She stopped. "I'll see you in an hour," he said. She was pulling on her coat when she found the note. It had been slid under her door sometime in the last few hours. A single piece of paper, folded once. No envelope. She almost stepped on it. She picked it up and unfolded it standing in the hallway. Still half-dressed, it said, "Give it back and this ends here. Keep it and you end here." She stood very still for a moment. Then she took a photo of the note on her phone. She put the note in her bag. She finished putting on her coat. She called Voss. He picked up before it rang. "Someone slid a note under my door," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm outside." She went to the window, looked down at the street. There was a black car parked across from her building. She couldn't see through the tinted glass, but she could see that it hadn't moved. "You stayed," she said. "I parked," he said. "There's a difference, is there?" A pause. "No," he said. "Not really." She picked up her bag. She picked up the notebook. She thought about 3 years of unpacked boxes and a lease she renewed annually, because the idea of committing to something permanent felt like a risk she hadn't earned the right to take. She thought about the orange cat in the alley who'd been there 8 months without anyone claiming it, and how she'd started leaving food by the dumpster 3 months ago, even though she'd told herself she wasn't going to get attached. She locked the door behind her. She went down the stairs. He was leaning against the passenger side of the car when she came out, coat still slightly damp from the rain. He looked at her when she came through the building's front door, and she had the strange, specific sensation of being seen, not sized up, not evaluated, not categorized, just seen. She handed him the note. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. "They know I came here," he said. "That doesn't worry me." He looked at her. "It should. Reinhardt wanted to know if I have something that could be used against you," she said. "Now he knows I do." She tucked the notebook under her arm. "And now he knows that when he threatened me, your car was already parked outside." Voss was very still. "So either he backs off," she said, "because the risk calculus doesn't work in his favor anymore, or he escalates, and we have documentation of exactly when and exactly how, and that becomes useful to us." She paused. "Either way, we're better positioned than we were 12 hours ago." He looked at her for a long moment. "You thought all of that out this morning," he said. "I've been up since 5. "I know," he said. "I saw your light." She held his gaze. He didn't look quiet. It was early yet. The city still in that particular grey pause between the night and the morning, the hour when things that happened in the dark were still close enough to touch. "Voss," she said. "Yes. Next time you decide to protect me by doing something I'll hate, tell me first." He looked at her for another moment. Then he opened the car door. "I'll try," he said. She got in. He walked around to the driver's side. He didn't tell her where they were going. She didn't ask, because she already had a guess, and because there was something steadying about moving toward a thing instead of away from it, about having the notebook in her hand and the work unfinished, and someone beside her who already knew what she kept in her pockets and had come anyway. She opened the notebook to the Renner account. She picked up her pencil. She started working.